For decades, Christopher Lloyd has carried one of the most beloved characters in movie history on his shoulders. But according to Lloyd himself, it took years before he truly understood what that role meant to people. At 86, the actor is still working, still studying scripts every day, and still being approached by fans who say one movie changed the course of their lives. What surprised him most was not the fame or the success, but hearing from engineers, doctors, scientists, and parents who said the story became part of their childhood and later part of their children's childhood too. Now, after 40 years of questions about sequels, reboots, and returning to the role again, Christopher Lloyd is finally opening up about why Back to the Future never really disappeared, why a fourth movie probably will not happen, and what Doc Brown ended up meaning to him personally. Christopher Lloyd has spent much of his life playing unusual men, outsiders, eccentrics, and characters that looked like they came from another universe entirely. Long before audiences connected him forever to Doc Brown, he had already built a reputation as one of Hollywood's most unpredictable actors. He terrified children as Judge Doom in Who Framed Roger Rabbit, became unforgettable as Uncle Fester in The Addams Family, and created one of television's strangest and funniest characters with Reverend Jim Ignatowski in Taxi. Yet even after all those performances, Lloyd eventually realized there was something completely different about the public's emotional attachment to Back to the Future. According to him, it was not immediate. In fact, he admitted it took several years before he understood just how deeply the movie had affected people. Lloyd explained that after the trilogy ended, the appreciation never seemed to fade. Instead of disappearing like many successful franchises from the 80s, the film somehow kept renewing itself with younger audiences. Children who watched it during its original release eventually grew up and introduced it to their own kids. That cycle repeated itself over and over until Lloyd began noticing something extraordinary happening around him. Fans were no longer simply talking about entertainment or nostalgia. Many told him the movie genuinely shaped their lives. Some said they became engineers or scientists because the story made invention and imagination feel exciting. Others said Doc Brown represented the kind of mentor or larger-than-life personality they wished they had while growing up. Lloyd admitted that none of his other projects had ever inspired that type of reaction on such a large scale. What fascinated Lloyd most was how universal the themes turned out to be. He believes almost everyone has wondered about time travel at some point in life. Children imagine seeing the future. Adults think about changing the past. Older people reflect on choices they made decades earlier. Back to the Future tapped directly into those feelings while still keeping the story entertaining and emotional. Lloyd especially pointed to the relationship between Doc Brown and Marty McFly as the emotional core that made the trilogy last far longer than anyone expected. To him, Marty represented a normal teenager trying to figure out life, while Doc was the strange genius who pushed him toward bigger possibilities. Lloyd compared Doc to those unforgettable adults children sometimes meet while growing up. The people who feel mysterious, eccentric, and somehow larger than reality itself. One line from the trilogy stayed with Lloyd more than almost anything else. "The future is what you make it. Make it a good one." He said that message continues to resonate with audiences decades later because it turns a fantasy adventure into something personal. Even though the trilogy involved time machines and paradoxes, the ending ultimately focused on responsibility, hope, and choosing what kind of future to build. As the years passed, Christopher Lloyd slowly became part of a much bigger conversation happening inside Hollywood. Studios began reviving old franchises everywhere. Sequels started appearing 30 or 40 years after the originals. Familiar characters returned because audiences still felt emotionally attached to them, and studios understood that nostalgia could be extremely profitable. Lloyd watched projects like Beetlejuice return decades later while speculation about Back to the Future 4 refused to disappear. Fans constantly asked whether Doc Brown and Marty McFly would ever come back for one final adventure. According to Lloyd, the discussion never fully stopped after Part 3 ended the trilogy. What makes the situation more complicated is that Lloyd himself clearly still loves Doc Brown. Unlike actors who seem frustrated by being linked forever to one role, Lloyd often appears genuinely happy whenever he revisits the character. Over the decades, he returned as Doc Brown in video games, comedy sketches, commercials, reunion appearances, and small cameos. Whether it was Robot Chicken or a surprise appearance in Seth MacFarlane's A Million Ways to Die in the West, Lloyd never acted embarrassed about returning to the role. In fact, he admitted that the love audiences still have for Doc Brown became one of the reasons he enjoyed stepping back into the lab coat whenever the opportunity appeared. But despite all that affection, Lloyd has repeatedly explained why another full movie probably will not happen. He believes the trilogy already completed its story arc in a satisfying way. By the end of Part 3, the DeLorean had been destroyed. Doc Brown had found a family with Clara, and Marty finally learned to stop letting pride control his decisions. From Lloyd's perspective, the emotional journey already reached its conclusion. He admitted there was once serious discussion about making a fourth movie, but he also said the creators eventually moved on from that period of their professional lives. Unless someone somehow develops what he called an incredibly unique story, he does not think the project will ever truly move forward. Another major obstacle is Michael J. Fox's health. Fox's Parkinson's disease forced him to gradually step away from acting after years of worsening physical difficulties. Lloyd remains extremely protective and supportive of his longtime co-star, but he also understands reality. Marty McFly cannot realistically lead another large-scale film in the same way he once did. That creates a difficult situation because the emotional connection between Marty and Doc is arguably the heart of the entire franchise. Lloyd knows audiences do not simply want time travel or nostalgia. They want those two characters together. At the same time, Lloyd also understands why some fans still refuse to let go of the idea completely. Hollywood now lives in an era dominated by legacy sequels, where aging actors return to beloved franchises one final time. Yet Back to the Future remains strangely untouched compared to so many others. Part of that comes from strong resistance by director Robert Zemeckis, writer Bob Gale, and producer Frank Marshall, all of whom have repeatedly spoken against rebooting or remaking the films. Lloyd seems to respect that decision deeply. To him, endlessly extending a franchise simply because it remains profitable can sometimes damage what made the original special in the first place. One reason Christopher Lloyd has remained respected for so long is because he never approached acting like celebrity culture. Even now, at 86 years old, he openly admits he does not closely follow modern Hollywood trends, social media buzz, or the newest generation of stars. While many veteran actors spend interviews criticizing modern entertainment or complaining about how the industry changed, Lloyd seems almost detached from those conversations entirely. His attention stays focused on one thing: whether there are still interesting characters left for him to play. He jokes that he obviously cannot play a young athlete anymore, but beyond that limitation, he still feels excited whenever a script presents something unusual or challenging. That attitude helps explain why retirement still is not in his vocabulary. Lloyd continues working steadily decades after most actors his age have disappeared from public life. Recently, he joined the cast of Wednesday as Professor Orloff and returned in Nobody 2 alongside Bob Odenkirk. What stands out is that Lloyd still speaks about acting with the enthusiasm of somebody much younger. He says the creative process itself remains the thrill. Whenever he receives a script, he immediately begins imagining every detail about the character. What kind of shoes would this man wear? Would he shave his mustache? What hairstyle fits his personality? How does he stand? Lloyd says he loves building characters piece by piece until he feels like he can get his soul into another person. That process has never stopped exciting him. He also believes he became a better actor with age because he finally learned how to trust himself. According to Lloyd, when he was younger, he lacked confidence and constantly questioned his instincts. That insecurity came partly from how difficult his early years were in New York. After arriving there in the early 60s, he attended the neighborhood playhouse while surviving however he could. Before that, he worked summer stock jobs where apprentices handled exhausting backstage labor like building sets and cleaning toilets. He remembered rehearsing an off-Broadway production of Hamlet at 1:30 in the morning because it was the only time the cast could gather after working other jobs. Lloyd's advice to young actors now is surprisingly simple. Just keep doing the work. Every opportunity matters, even the exhausting or humiliating ones, because experience slowly builds confidence. That mentality may explain why Lloyd still feels energized while acting despite acknowledging his own mortality more openly now. He admitted that being 86 changes how a person thinks about time. At 26, death feels abstract and distant. At 86, he knows physical decline eventually becomes unavoidable no matter how healthy he currently feels. Yet instead of sounding bitter or frightened, Lloyd approaches aging almost pragmatically. He hopes he can continue acting until 105 if possible. The idea sounds almost absurd, but when listening to him speak, it becomes obvious he genuinely means it. Interestingly, Lloyd also seems most emotionally connected not to huge blockbuster fame, but to the relationships created through long-term collaborations. He still describes Taxi as one of the proudest experiences of his life because of how close the cast remained over the decades. Danny DeVito, Marilu Henner, Judd Hirsch, Tony Danza, and even the memory of Andy Kaufman still represent something deeply personal to him. Lloyd called the group unusually cohesive and even admitted he occasionally imagines bringing the show back with the surviving cast members. Although Christopher Lloyd became permanently connected to Doc Brown, one reason audiences continued respecting him is because he never stopped experimenting with completely different characters. Even in his 80s, he still seems driven by curiosity rather than nostalgia alone. Lloyd openly says that no two characters are ever the same to him, and he continues treating every role as a fresh challenge. That philosophy became obvious again with his recent projects, where he moved from action comedy in Nobody 2 to dark gothic humor in Wednesday. Rather than trying to protect some legendary image from the past, Lloyd appears comfortable jumping into strange supporting roles simply because they interest him creatively. His relationship with Bob Odenkirk during the Nobody films says a lot about how Lloyd operates professionally at this stage of his life. He described Odenkirk as flexible, imaginative, experienced, and completely focused on making the project stronger rather than protecting his own ego. Lloyd clearly admires actors who stay loose and collaborative, and it sounds like he sees some of his own mentality reflected there. In Nobody 2, Lloyd's role shifted more toward being a father figure rather than an action centerpiece, but he seemed perfectly comfortable with that adjustment. At an age where many actors obsess over preserving their status, Lloyd appears more interested in contributing meaningfully to the story itself. That same openness explains why he still talks so warmly about playing Uncle Fester in Addams Family Values. Lloyd revealed that his connection to the character actually began during childhood when his parents subscribed to The New Yorker. While most adults focused on the magazine's articles, Lloyd cared almost exclusively about the cartoons created by Charles Addams. He became fascinated with the strange, mischievous members of the Addams family long before Hollywood ever adapted them for film. Uncle Fester especially stayed in his imagination because Lloyd saw him as chaotic but oddly lovable rather than genuinely dangerous. Decades later, when he unexpectedly received the offer to play the character himself, it almost felt like a childhood fantasy circling back into his life. Lloyd also praised his chemistry with Joan Cusack in Addams Family Values, calling their comedic rhythm especially strong. Many fans still consider their scenes together among the funniest parts of the film because of how naturally their bizarre personalities collided on screen. What makes that story more interesting is that Lloyd never describes acting in technical or intellectual language. He talks about characters emotionally, almost instinctively, as if he simply tries to understand how their minds operate from the inside. That instinctive approach may explain why even his strangest performances still feel human underneath the exaggeration. Another example is his role as Professor Orloff in Wednesday. Lloyd said he immediately loved how radical and unusual the character felt within the series' dark comedic world. Returning to the Addams Family universe decades later clearly amused him, but he did not approach it like somebody lazily recycling old nostalgia. Instead, he seemed excited that the writers gave him something fresh to play. Even now, Lloyd still dreams about roles he never got to perform. He admitted that Don Quixote remains a personal fantasy role for him because he considers the character extraordinary. What makes Christopher Lloyd's reflections about Back to the Future so emotional today is that he no longer talks about Doc Brown as just another famous role. At 86, he speaks about the character almost like someone who changed his life forever. Lloyd once said that if he could speak to Doc Brown directly, he would thank him for being an inspiration and for opening his eyes to limitless imagination. To Lloyd, Doc became more than an eccentric scientist. He represented fearless curiosity, creativity, and the drive to keep moving forward no matter how dangerous things became. That mindset still reflects Lloyd's real life today. Even in his 80s, his days are built around reading, studying scripts, exercising, and continuing to work. Off-screen, he describes himself as calm and reflective, but once he steps onto a set, the energy immediately returns. Lloyd admits he now thinks about aging and mortality far more than he did when he was young, which gives deeper meaning to the themes of time, consequences, and second chances that defined Back to the Future. And yet, he still refuses to slow down. Lloyd continues accepting new roles, dreaming about future projects like Don Quixote, and even discussing the possibility of reviving Taxi. In many ways, that may be the real reason Back to the Future survived for so long. It was never only about time travel. The story endured because it believed in imagination, friendship, and hope for the future. For Christopher Lloyd, Doc Brown ultimately became proof that one character can continue inspiring people across multiple generations long after the movie itself first ended. After 40 years, Christopher Lloyd still sees Doc Brown as more than just a movie character. To him, the role became a symbol of imagination, risk, and the idea that the future is never completely written yet. Even at 86, he is still acting, still dreaming about new roles, and still surprising fans who thought Hollywood legends from his generation had already slowed down. What is your favorite Christopher Lloyd role of all time? Doc Brown, Uncle Fester, Judge Doom, or somebody else? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more stories about the actors and movies that shaped generations.